This morning we are starting a new course that we've titled Different by Design. I didn't come up with that. There's 100 different titles with that on it. So I ripped that off right now. Yeah. So Different by Design, and the subtitle is Enjoying God's Design for Manhood and Womanhood. This is a course that we've wanted to come to for some time, just tried to find the right time in the calendar to do it, and so I'm excited to come to this course beginning today. So let's just start with what this is going to cover. Okay, let me just do that. There's a number of things we're going to be covering here in this course. That's not working either, is it? There it goes. Okay, all right. So some of the fundamental things we're going to cover as we think about biblical manhood and womanhood begins with the very basic question of what are we as human beings, right? What are we as human beings? How are we different than not just the animals, but how are we different from rocks and trees and concepts and ideas? Like, what is it about human beings that make us unique? And how does that touch on this whole question of manhood and womanhood? And right along with that is the question of self. Like, what is the self? Okay. How do we understand human identity as individuals? Like, where do we find our identity? That's a big question for today. We're going to ask questions, basic questions, that if you roll the clock back not that long, this would have been kind of a useless course to ask the question, what is a man or what is a woman? But now we have to actually define those things. And we have to do so carefully and thoughtfully. And doing so as we reflect on how the culture has a pretty tough time defining that. Right? And right along with that is, what does it mean to be a man in this world? To be a woman in the world that God made us? What is manhood? What is womanhood? What is masculinity? What is femininity? Right. Usually when you hear those, you usually hear those with adjectives attached, so toxic masculinity. Or you hear about the feminine movement. What does that mean? And what does that have to do with the way God created us as men and women? I have to deal with that. There's this whole understanding of gender identity, or ideology rather, that has really come into vogue over the last 50 or so years. And this has become the dominant view in secular culture. So what is that? How does that compare to what God says in the way that He designed us? And that's going to touch immediately on not just gender, like is that a coherent idea at all? But if it is, then how is gender expressed across the whole gamut of a human experience? How is gender and gender role expressed in the home, in the family, in marriage? How is it to be expressed in the church? How is it to be expressed in society at large? Right? What roles do men and women have in these different spheres? Are they the same? Are they interchangeable? Are they different? Right? We go on to, of course, from the idea of gender in general to then how we express that sexually. So sexual ethics, and we'll talk about marriage, and we'll talk about singleness. And then hopefully as we get to these, we'll get to your questions and some dad jokes along the way. Those are important as well. So as you can see from this catalog of subjects we have to talk about in this course, there's going to be some sensitive things we're talking about, right? So just heads up, I think most of us are high school and above, so we should be able to deal with this. But I'll make you a promise, though. As we talk about these things, I will not say anything that would be... I won't come anywhere close to what you would see on a general commercial on television. How about that? Or a random song you might hear on the radio. Right? We're going to be more sensitive and modest than any of those things. We'll keep it cleaner than what you hear on TV. Okay? So... that's what we're going to cover. Now, I want to think through with you why we need to do this. Why do we need to do this? Why do we need this class? And to answer that question, I think we just need to even start with the title of the course. Now, I bought a whole new bag of candy for this course, okay? And I'm getting older, but the shoulder can at least get back to at least the second row, all right? So we're going to try this. So you got to interact with this course. This would be great. So here's my question to you. Different by design, enjoying God's design for manhood and womanhood. Let's suppose, to explain why this is a necessary class for us. Suppose I submitted this as a potential course at Ohio State. I'm sorry, the Ohio State. There you go, okay? Or any local university, or any local high school, or as a matter of fact, a great many Sunday school classes in a number of mainline churches around us. Suppose we submit this as a recommendation for a course to be taught this fall. Okay? What would be some of the problems people would immediately raise before we even got off the ground? What from the title would you find objectionable if you were on one of the boards at Ohio State determining what class would be permitted? Okay, yes, I got one. Yep.
You're a little bit narrow when you say it's God's design.
Okay. Why is that? Why is that narrow?
Because what if somebody doesn't believe in God? I feel like you're not including everybody no matter their age.
Okay, good. It's very exclusive. Here, help me out with that, John. Relay. I'm glad that cup was empty. Very good. There we go. Very good. Good. Yeah. God's design. That seems the fact that there's a designer at all, that's religion, right? And we shouldn't be biased. We shouldn't be bringing in these religious ideas. Let's just be neutral. And of course, to be neutral means we start not with the designer, but with what? An evolutionary approach to humanity, right? Let's just start with that and nothing else. And besides, when you say God, well, which God? We're obviously going to be assuming here the Christian God. Well, why the Christian God? Why not some other God? And even if you limit it to the Christian God, you realize that there's an awful lot of Christians who are going to disagree with what you say on this slide. All of these things are going to be undercutting. Okay, so good. The designer, the God who designs. What else might be objectionable? Caleb. Marcus. Not Marcus. Elizabeth, yeah.
I was thinking, a woman can do everything a man can do. There's no difference there.
So the difference, right? You got a Kit Kat coming your way. Here it comes. Ready? You ready? Sorry, Kelly. Keeping it lively. Right. She's pointing out the fact that I'm assuming that there are differences. Right? That's pretty old-fashioned. Men and women aren't different. They're what? Equal. We want to talk about equality, and then there's another word that goes right along with that called equity. We can talk about the difference between those two. So let's not create differences that aren't there. Whatever a man can do, a woman can do that a man can do. But there's even a bit of a problem with what I just said there. And what other objections might somebody raise to this? Okay, Asher in the back.
I think somebody with a secular viewpoint might think like somebody can identify as any kind of gender. That's probably one problem that I think.
So by any kind, you mean like one of two options, or one of a number of options, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. So why are there only two options here? All right. This assumes that sex and gender is what's often referred to as binary. Sorry. Help me out with Asher back there. So that assumes sex and gender. Now, I have to ask whether he was trying to bank that one off. Now that assumes that sex and gender are binary, right? Binary, I mean, there's two options. Now, we have to talk, is there a difference between sex and gender, and what is the relationship between the two? But the fact that we're saying that there's only two options within either of those categories would be very objectionable, wouldn't it? Because they're not just two. Now there's a spectrum, right? And you could be anywhere within that spectrum. And so to even suggest that there are two is inherently problematic. So we've found objections to the word different, to the word design, or God's design. We've got a problem with manhood and womanhood. There's one more word I've got up here that, yeah.
Well, it's even the biggest problem is you are not allowed to tell them who they should be.
Okay, good, very good. That goes to that question of self and identity that we mentioned on the previous slide. Because who gets to determine a person's identity? The person does. And we're supposed to recognize that and celebrate that and never question that. And if we ever do that, that's inherently problematic, which I think we're going to touch on that in this course. Another objectionable thing here. All right, here you go, John. I'll just pass John the bag of candy. How about that? All right. But here's one more we might mention. How about the word enjoying? What would be the rub with the word enjoying in a class like this? And now this one I'm thinking closer to home for Christians. Maybe Christians who aren't quite settled on gender roles or how those shake out. There's more commonality on, okay, gender and sex need to be related to one another. There's a God. He has designed us. There are differences, but where those lie. And there's a sense in which a great many Christians would hear this title and struggle a little bit with that. Because very often, when we cover these things, especially when we talk about gender roles in the home or the church or society, it's often stated negatively. Here's what you can't do. And that can often come across as a killjoy, right? A bunch of negative things, all the stuff that we can't do and why we can't do it. Even if you can show that the Bible teaches a sex and gender binary, cisnormativity is now the term that's being used, and we'll define all those as we go on. It's a big thing to go from that to then embracing it as not just a good for individuals in society, but something that we don't just have to grit our teeth and bear. Something that we don't just make our way through, right? But something that it's actually for our joy. Because this touches on God's good design even before sin for humanity. And he didn't design this so that either men or women would struggle getting on with their masculinity and femininity in this world. Before the fall, Adam and Eve were perfectly designed and suited for life as men and women in the world that God made. And to the degree that they lived their lives in accordance with God's design, in accordance with his revealed word, they would flourish. There would be satisfaction. There would be joy with God and with each other and with the world that God made. And there's a sense in which, even though we've wrecked that with the fall, we now experience a great deal of dissatisfaction. We have a great deal of conflict, especially when we talk about gender. We have a great deal of suffering. We're going to talk about all the ways that affects our manhood and womanhood. The fact of the matter is, notwithstanding the fall and the curse, the design stands. The design was good. How many times does God say in Genesis 1 that what he made was good? All right. So people often think about the Bible's teaching on gender and sexuality as a straitjacket, right? Just to restrict our freedom, to downplay our joy, rather than promote our flourishing and our satisfaction. And it's just the opposite. Rightly understood, it's going to be just the opposite. And we're going to look at lots of examples of what happens when we deviate from that good design and the impact that has, detrimental impact that has on our lives. Okay? That's why we need the course. And that's why we're going to cover this beginning today. So let me just, I'm making these claims. I'm saying this is going to be like right off the bat rejected, right, by secular society as a non-starter. In fact, many people in the church are going to reject that. But let me just try to back that up with some examples. Okay? So, here's a study that came out in 23. I know you can't read that. I'll try to read it for you here. I can't really even read it. This is from Gallup. And here's the study. LGBTQ plus identity by generation in 2023. Which of the following do you consider yourself to be? This is the question. You can select straight, heterosexual, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. Basically, are you heterosexual or other? Okay? Takes that way. All right? So here's the total number of respondents on this poll that self-identify something other than heterosexual, something other than the way God made us. Okay? Total LGBTQ by generation. Baby boomers, 2.3% total. Gen X, 4.5% total. Millennials, 9.8% total. And just cards on the table here, I'm right on that cusp between Gen X and millennials, but I'm going to identify as the Gen X generation, okay? For various reasons, mainly music preference, okay? All right, so what's happening? Baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, what's the number doing? It's going up, right? Okay? Gen Z, 22.3%. Self-identifying in this random survey as some form of LGBTQ+. That's more than 1 in 5 people. Now, I'm going to say straight up that an awful lot of these polls that I see, I'm dubious at the outset. Okay? I think a great number of polls, political and otherwise, are designed to shape and create public opinion rather than reflect it. Okay? But 22.3%, even if you subtract some from that, that's pretty remarkable that this generation of young people, I sound old, the Gen Z generation, all right, the current generation that has now lived over the past 15, 20 years coming up with this, right? How long ago was it that the Obergefell ruling came down? 2015? What is that? Almost not quite 10 years? And then it was well within the culture about 5 years earlier, right? In 2008, 2007, Obama's running on traditional marriage. Think about that. Democrats, their platform was affirming traditional marriage, right, between a man and a woman. And next thing you know, we're where we're at now, where we can't even define what a woman is. Okay? Anyway, so this is the generation that's now lived through this, over the rapid movement of this over the past few years. More than 1 in 5. So you go grab anyone from the Gen Z generation at random, 1 out of 5 are going to identify as LGBTQ. Like, what happened? How do you go from 2%, which I think is high, a number for the boomer generation, to 22%? How do you have a 20% increase? So I don't think we're exaggerating. I'll give you some more examples how this is relevant. So one of the questions is well, just let people do what they want, right? And then there's a sense in which, we don't want to be I don't want the government involved in a lot of things in our lives, okay? But this is unavoidable, right? This isn't just you choose whatever you want. As Holly mentioned earlier, if we get into a situation where we're forced to affirm a person's identity with which we disagree, what happens then? Okay, and this is what we're seeing happening in our country and in other countries, right? So here's an Ohio State professor from Shawnee State University who was let go because he refused to use a student's preferred pronouns. And I watched some stuff on this and read some stuff from him. He was very concessive in his class, willing to refer to the student by their last name. He just wouldn't submit to the university's attempt to compel his speech to use language with which he disagrees. Okay? But that wasn't sufficient. It wasn't enough just to refer to the student by the last name, to try to be as respectful and loving to the student as possible. No, he has to submit to his or her demands, or they or them, whatever it was in this case. All right? And now he spent years in court battles, and he won. Thankfully, he won, because in our country, we do have a freedom of speech, and that was being infringed upon, and they were able to prove that here. But you understand how long it took him just to go through that process? Right? So that's in Ohio. And it's not just in the university settings. Here's another one. Local teacher forced to resign after refusing to use the student's preferred pronouns. This is from Jackson Township. This is Jackson Middle School. This is 20 minutes from here. And there's a court case going through the process right now, objecting to the fact that the school was trying to compel her speech against her religious beliefs and a number of other things. So this isn't we're not blowing this out of proportion. This is happening. Now, thankfully, we do live in a country where we have a First Amendment right. But if you go to other countries that don't have it, you go to Canada, it's much worse. So there's the authorities attempting to compel our speech. But then just besides that, you've got, this is not just in the classroom, it's in the workplace, isn't it? I've talked to some people at this church who work in environments where they are compelled to use preferred pronouns for people. And you see this showing up. Here's a LinkedIn profile, and now we're including pronouns. Sarah King here, I don't know if this is a real person or not, but Sarah King wants you to refer to her as they, them. I don't even, we'll talk about the use of pronouns in grammar and the problems that ensue whenever we do things like this. But just to show you, this is a thing, right? It's a thing in the school systems. It's a thing in the workforce. And look, anywhere you go, right? Has anybody seen these? Right. So now we not only have the man and woman symbol, we now have this. Right. I was working on my slide. One of my kids said, "Dad, what's going on with that one? That's not a very good drawer, right?" But no, you see what I'm saying? I was at a coffee shop not long ago, and I saw this sign. I had to go find it. Okay, what do we have? Man, woman, what? Unicorn. This person has two. They're making light of it, but you just whatever you want, as long as you wash your hands, right? That's the title now. Roll the clock back 20. Could you imagine this? Was this even thinkable? Was this coherent? 20 years ago.
Saturday Night Live.
Saturday Night Live it would have been, yeah. These are all coming true. Basic things like bathroom types. Government is largely embracing gender ideology. I don't think I'm going to get audio on this, but this was a Senate confirmation hearing, and you've got Senator Rand Paul there interviewing the Assistant Secretary of Health, Rachel Levine, who's a man that transitioned to a woman. And I'm not going to get audio on this. But what Rand Paul he's asking here is, do you agree with the government basically pushing sex change practices on minors? And do you agree that minors are able to give consent to something like that? And there he is answering it, right? What's unbelievable is not just that this happened, that there was a Senate hearing we had to ask a question, can a minor give consent to having their genitals surgically removed? A minor can't give consent to that, but that's where we're at. What's even worse is that person was passed by a majority of the Senate. They are currently the Assistant Secretary of Health, advising policy for this nation. And that's just one example of among a great many that we could cite. So that's the confusion that we're living in as a culture. And so now we have to do something with it. We have to understand this as Christians. How are we going to evaluate this as Christians? How are we going to train our children in light of this? How do we engage our culture with the gospel? Because this is not going to be fundamentally good news for people, and we're going to see the statistics on that. But there's an alternative that we can offer as Christians. But in order to offer the alternative, we have to understand what we're offering an alternative to. Okay? This stuff isn't coming. It's here. It's unavoidable. And that's why we need the class. So here's how we're going to go about it. Okay, here's the outline for the class. We're going to talk about manhood and womanhood according to God's good design. We're going to look at Scripture. We're going to see what the Bible's teaching is on this. What does the Christian worldview have to say on men and women, manhood, womanhood, roles, and everything else besides? Before we get to that, though, I think we need to start with kind of where we're at as a culture. And we're going to talk about manhood and womanhood according to secularism. Where are we? That previous slide gives you kind of a good idea, but there's more to talk about. There's a whole new lexicon that we have to understand in order to be able to even understand the ideas that are being communicated and the policies and practices that then follow from them. So where are we? But then how do we get here? Like that chart that had the boomers and the Gen Z, this rapid change. Okay? How did that happen? Where do we go from this is not even a coherent sentence to, yeah, absolutely, that's totally makes sense. How do we get there? But even before we do that, here's what we need to do. This is the next thing we're going to come to next week. How do we understand and evaluate and engage this as Christians? Not just in terms of behaviors, but in terms of ideas. So how do we do that as Christians? Okay? We're not just going to say, here's what the Bible says, and don't do that. There's a place for that. But in order to put that in context, that people would even be able to make sense of it, we have to have a way of understanding and evaluating and engaging the ideas that gave rise to this. Okay? So we're not just going to be looking at behaviors, but ideas. And there's a reason for that. Okay? I'm going to give you two reasons why we're going to be in this study, not just looking at behavior, but ideas and beliefs. And the first is this: beliefs precede and produce behaviors. Beliefs precede and produce behaviors. A man's belief that he is a woman precedes his actions, his behavior, his pursuit of, say, sex reassignment surgery. Okay? There was a certain belief that gave rise to his actions. People will self-identify as gay based on their same-sex desires. Even prior to acting on those desires, they will come up and begin using an identity based on something that precedes even actions. So beliefs precede behaviors, but they also produce them. And another way of saying this is simply to say that ideas have consequences. So if you believe that people have a moral right, to be called by their preferred pronouns, you're going to be more likely to use those preferred pronouns for people. You're going to be more likely to vote for laws that would compel people to use people's preferred pronouns. If you're a legislator, you're going to be compelled to vote for those kinds of things. If you're a baker, here's another court case. If you're a baker and you believe same-sex marriage is immoral, that's a fundamental commitment, fundamental belief that you have. You're going to decline a request that conflicts with that belief. Say, making a certain kind of wedding cake for a same-sex wedding. And these aren't hypotheticals. This is happening. So we need to talk about ideas, not just behaviors, because beliefs, ideas, they precede and they produce behaviors. But it's also true that beliefs precede and produce other beliefs. And this is where we begin to get into how do we get from the 1 or 2% all the way up to the 22%. What prior beliefs would be required to believe that a man can become a woman? You'd have all kinds of prior beliefs, right? What would you have to believe in order to believe that a man could become a woman? You're going to have a different view than the Christian view on reality. We'll talk about a system of a philosophical system called existentialism over against what we might call essentialism. The difference between saying reality is self-determined versus reality is inherent and unchanging. So that's a prior understanding of reality. There's prior beliefs about knowledge. How do we know what a man and a woman is? Prior beliefs about human beings. What is the self? What is identity? What is the relationship between me and my body? That kind of language. this appendage to me. Prior beliefs about creation. Is this purposeless evolutionary product, or is this purposeful design? And a whole host of other beliefs besides would go into that, right? If we're taught to believe that we determine our own human nature, then we're going to have no problem adopting the belief that a man can become a woman. But how do we get to that point? Beliefs precede and produce behaviors, but they also precede and produce other beliefs, which in turn produce other behaviors. So that's going to take us to what we covered a few years ago in this class on the question of worldviews. We're not just dealing with facts, we're dealing with a philosophy of facts. We're not just dealing with discrete questions, we're dealing with a philosophy that goes behind those questions. What we're dealing with, in other words, is not just behaviors, not just this idea or that, but the whole thing, what we would call a worldview. And in order to really be able to engage this, we have to think worldviewishly in order to be able to comprehend what is even being articulated, why somebody would get to that point, and fundamentally why we could train our children otherwise, and why we can be able to speak to our culture in a way that they can maybe hear us and hear not just the problems with the current secular view of humanity, but the answer, the hope that's available only in the gospel. So next week, bring your handouts back, because we're going to review our approach to worldviews, how we understand worldviews, the questions worldviews answer, how they are going to contribute to understanding where we are and how we got here, but then also how to evaluate them and how to be able to leverage that for the sake of our kids and for the gospel.